All right, by rules, I have 30 minutes. It's now 7:13. For starters, I'd certainly like to thank the hosts of this that include the Starkey Citizens for Clean and Healthy Environment. And in particular, my host tonight, I have my wife here who's in the audience. So afterwards, we'll stay at Sunrise Landing. And we had dinner there, Tony and Jack and some other folks, and we enjoyed the Bob and Barb's cooking and whatnot very much. Now, ironically, one of the things that we've done, Tony and I have appeared 3 times together, in Pennsylvania a couple of years ago, in Lubbock, Texas, and now tonight. And it is important to appreciate that at least in 2 out of those 3 times, the organizers have been people who have concerns about high-volume hydraulic fracturing. What I would really like to see in the future is the other side of this formula actually organize 1 or 2 of these things, because in fact that has not happened. Now, what we're going to do is, first of all, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in Western New York. I watched Jimmy Clark win the Watkins Glen Grand Prix in 1962 with my uncle. I was in about 9th grade or thereabout at that particular point in time. Little did I realize that this was one of the more efficient ways of putting CO2 in the atmosphere ever invented by mankind, driving one of these high-powered gas guzzlers around for a couple of hours. And it continues in that particular tradition. Some of my best scientific work ever has been done in this area in the Finger Lakes District. You may recognize Route 414 heading down into Watkins Glen. That particular road cut has stayed clear for 30 years, largely because I've come along with geological field trips once a year and basically cut down the brush. And this lower picture right here indicates some of the observations concerning natural hydraulic fractures. And in fact, it's important to appreciate that this entire area has world-class examples of hydraulic fracturing. Really rather amazing. Now, I've returned. This is Taganic Falls. The world's class outcrop of hydraulic fracturing is at Taganic Falls. Here we are filming a PBS TV series called America Revealed, Electric Nation. This was a couple of years ago in a snowfall. So that my experience here has really been quite a romance with this particular area, with the Finger Lakes. I was probably the first person to fully realize the impact of gas shales and what they might have on the world, as your moderators indicated. And there were 2 thoughts that I had at that particular point in time. This was somewhere in the middle of 2007. One of them was, I made a calculation. I thought this was going to be a huge resource, but I thought, if I'm not right, gas shale will cause an investment loss of untold billions of dollars. Those billions of dollars, incidentally, are the billions of dollars that come from your retirement investments and the like. So that's one side of it. Then, if I'm right, I thought this gas will cause a delay in developing renewable energy and add more carbon to the atmosphere. I mean, talk about a moral dilemma. This is a lose-lose. Now, there are, of course, very positive things about this as well, but these were the 2 thoughts that I had in 2007, neither of them very attractive. Note lack of concern about water, and what you'll find is that neither Tony nor I will spend a lot of time with water contamination per se. There are other issues that are much more important. One of the things that I might point out is that Tony and I have not only come together in person, but also in the literature. We've produced a commentary in the science journal Nature, a point counterpoint. You're certainly welcome to download this on my website at Penn State. Tony probably has it on his website as well. And so here's Tony with Yoko Ono. And there I am waving that notebook around that you're all signing right there. Largely, this is historical enough, this particular debate about fracking, which has climbed to the level of abortion, gun control, and climate change. And what I'm doing with this notebook is I'm leaving behind an archive so that 100 years from now, when some historian from Cornell wants to know what Tony's involvement is in this, Tony has signed that notebook 4 or 5 times, and they will stumble across the date January 23rd, 2013, and see, oh yes, Tony was in Dundee, as were all of you in the audience. All right, now, why did I take this particular point of view? I've already told you 2 reasons why fracking and the production of natural gas should not proceed forward. And yet I say right here, no, it's too valuable. And I've brought a number of books that when I do this, I've always brought 2 or 3 books and recommend that you take a look at them. The first is A Climate Fix by a colleague of mine at the University of Colorado. And The Climate Fix is all about the iron law of climate policy. Now, Tony and I absolutely agree that climate change is an incredibly important thing and has to be done, and has to be done with the leadership of the United States, you and Tony and myself. But there is this iron law of climate policy, which is that when there's a conflict between policies promoting economic growth and policies restricting carbon dioxide, economic growth wins every time. This is a reality, and it's that reality that allows me to argue the point that I'm going to argue tonight. And what it says down here in a New York Times review of this particular book is that people will make trade-offs, but the one thing that won't be traded off is keeping the lights on at a reasonable cost. And so what we're going to do is have a conversation about how we can achieve that in Dundee from now until we're on completely sustainable energy. And let me give you a hint. It's all about natural gas. There is no other route. And given the reluctance of affluent Europeans to make sacrifices, now here's the Europeans who are really into this. What are the odds of persuading billions of people in poorer countries to pay more for energy today in return for a cooler climate at the end of the century? That's a really important question, and that's a question for the audience. All right, now, there are a number of stakeholders, 3 to be exact, with a fondness for the land. Now, you can see the 3 stakeholders right here. In the foreground, you see a vineyard. In the middle background, you see tourism, the tourist trade. What you don't see is what's in the far background, which is the decaying farms of the region. And of course, you've all heard the argument that in fact it is this group of stakeholders that owns the largest amount of land in the region. It is this group of stakeholders that is in the most desperate need for help that fracking in this particular area might bring. There's also a 4th stakeholder that I have to point out, and that's industry and commerce. And this, too, is very important. In the city of Watkins Glen, the industry and commerce employs hundreds of people. These have to be taken care of as well. Moral ambiguity. That's what we're going to talk about in this particular talk, because I pointed out in that slide that I showed with Tony and myself above the Nature article. There's a moral ambiguity to both sides of the argument. Neither of us have the moral high ground. All right, now, the need for necessary sacrifice. I think that if I've become famous at anything, it is having this conversation with a reporter in 2.5 or 3 years ago. And in this conversation, a reporter came to me and said, Tony Ingraffea thinks that there's going to be 16 well pads per square mile. And I checked out Tony's websites, and it was true. He was showing pictures of fracking in Wyoming where there are 16 well pads per square mile. In fact, as I emailed Tony and said, Tony, you're misrepresenting the case. That's not the way it's going to be. And along with that, what I did was I said here, this is a quote from that particular article. It's that type of sacrifice that we're talking about. It's a necessary sacrifice. And this has become famous because the people of Binghamton now wear T-shirts with my name on the back saying, we don't want to live in the sacrifice zone. But in fact, here is the moral ambiguity of the whole thing. we as Americans eventually moving forward, moving into this world that both Tony and I want, the world of sustainability, will require a tremendous amount of sacrifice, not just a little bit, and it's a necessary sacrifice that the entire nation will have to pay, not just the vintners or the farmers of Watkins Glen or Dundee. It's a very complex industry, this business of drilling, and it's complex enough that there will be accidents. Accidents will take place. Now, one of the things that industry has learned the last number of years, if you watch the evolution of ads for natural gas on TV, finally, after a couple of 3 years, ANGA, which is the industry lobby group that supports natural gas and puts ads on TV, they've moved to the point where the first line they say is, there will be risk. There will be risk. It's unavoidable. But there's a risk to all sorts of things that we do. Let me give you an example of this. We'll see the next slide right in here. How about automobile driving right in here? Now look at what happened back in 1970s. There were 54,000 deaths in 1972, and basically that number, 1 year, the automobile accidents caused more deaths than the entire number of people killed during the Vietnam War. Now what's important though is risk. How do we evaluate risk? Because you're all here in Starkey Township making some decisions about risk, and you're going to vote on that. So we look at the risk, deaths per 100 million vehicle miles. And what you're going to do is observe very carefully that over a 40-year period of time, the automobile industry has become 4 times safer. This is an example of what happens in industry. Industry is not static. You can't present statistics from one moment in time. Tony will talk about wells leaking. And the implication of that is that the industry will never learn how to keep wells from leaking methane. And this is an example of what industry does. They've made it 4 times safer. Have they eliminated the risk completely? No, they haven't done that. So at any rate, what I'm going to do is present 4 myths. And Tony is very famous for his talks on which he points out there are a number of facts that are true regarding industry, but there are also myths associated with those facts. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take Tony's myths and turn them back around and again go back to the fact. Here's the first myth, which is industry does not learn how to reduce risk. You know, this is paraphrasing what Tony has said in talks, but not directly quoting him. And this is basically what we see in a website that is put up by Cornell. Here's an example of wells that have leaked. And what I want to do is call your attention to a period in the 1970s when automobile accident rates were 4 per 100 million miles driven, and then B, 40 years later, and look at the rate at which wells in the Canadian Rockies have been successfully contained, prevented from leaking. Does that mean that all wells are now performing perfectly? No, it does not. And does it mean that they will ever perform perfectly? No, it does not. But what it means is that over time, industry has evolved. They've learned to do things more efficiently and safer. And you can put up a whole number of these things. You can look at the oil industry in the 19th century. The Cuyahoga River had some tremendous fires on it in the 19th century. Cuyahoga River is in Ohio. It flows north to Cleveland. When the EPA was first constituted, there was a fire on the Cuyahoga River. Didn't kill anyone. It was a minor fire compared to the 19th century fires, but that got a big story in Time magazine in the 1960s as being an example of what pollution actually does. If you look at the Cuyahoga River today, it's as clean as it's been since the time that Rockefeller put his refineries on that river 150 years ago, and it continues to improve year by year by year. Industry gets better in what it does. All right, myth number 2. There are no industrial well pads in the Finger Lakes region right here. Now, one of the things Tony has done in a couple of his talks is he said, if you're in a region that has no well pads, industry argues that somehow or another putting these single pads out, 1 per square mile, is worse than no pads at all. This is an argument that you can't use right in here. In fact, as I point out, that as we were driving over to Dundee tonight, we passed a well pad just out of town on the left side of the road. You can see these former well pads, most of them are now recovered, as you drive up Route 14. This is the density of wells that have been drilled in this particular area. So it's not a myth that applies to this particular area. The industry has been here. It's been drilling for nearly a century. And how many people have been affected by the gas industry in the last century? Okay, myth number three, industry is still clueless after doing high-volume hydrofracture wells 20,000 times. Now, basically, what this starts out is that industry has argued that they've hydraulically fractured 1 million wells. That's true, but what has happened, of course, is that Tony will point out that high-volume hydraulic fracturing is a different animal. Yes, it is. Yeah. 20,000 of those have been done, and the industry has learned a great deal after doing 20,000 of those. Pennsylvania right now has 6,391 active Marcellus wells. This is the one really that's the core of what we're going to talk about, which is that natural gas is not a clean fuel. And I hope that this comes up as a question because I have as part of my slide deck slides I'm not going to be able to cover in this main talk, but that we'll spend a couple of minutes on later on. Michael Mann is my colleague at Penn State. We taught classes back to back, and in fact he was the originator of the hockey stick. You all know the famous hockey stick, and it was his emails that were stolen from East Anglica University. And he would walk into the classroom and we would sort of share the types of emails that we've been receiving. I've received a lot of very derogatory emails, very much the same way that the hockey stick man, Michael Mann, has. I mean, we literally, day after day, would share these. All right, so Mann is quoted on August 17th, 2012, and this becomes very important. It is ironic that the shift from coal to gas has helped bring U.S. closer to meeting some of the greenhouse gas targets in 1997. Kyoto Treaty on global warming, the gas boom, is actually one of a number of reasons for cautious optimism. Here is one of the leaders in terms of evaluating global climate change and trying to figure out what to do about it, saying the natural gas industry has helped. Here is a very stunning slide from New England. Notice 10 years ago in New England generated 16% of its electricity from coal. 10 years later, which is the middle graph right there, 6% of its electricity was generated from coal. Basically, what this is a displacement of natural gas by natural gas of coal-fired power generation. And that displacement caused the result that Michael Mann was talking about, which I'll show you in just a minute. In the meantime, that far graph is probably as relevant as anything. Moving into the future, New England looks to install a very large generating capacity associated with the wind. You'll note that natural gas-fired power is increasing at exactly the same rate. Why is that? All right, well, here's the first half of the question that we've asked. Why was Michael Mann being interviewed by an AP reporter saying the natural gas industry has really contributed something? This is the EIA graphs of the carbon dioxide load from America over the last 20 years. And what I'll do is I'll call your attention to the last 5 bars from 2008, when the gas industry and natural hydraulic fracturing really accelerated. That caused the price of gas to collapse, incidentally saving a lot of you an awful lot of money if you use any type of natural gas at all to heat your house or heat your stoves. That's also displaced coal. Now, the argument, of course, and it's one that I was concerned about in that first slide, which is that that's going to slow the development of renewable energies. That's a very valid argument, but the reality is that others have said this is a bridge fuel. And this is more or less why this is a bridge fuel. All right, now, I had the good luck of driving up here. I stopped by the Lakewood Vineyards just this afternoon. And actually, my wife and I sampled a little bit of wine. We bought a bottle of Lakewood wine right here. This is a Riesling, and I really like Western New York. Finger Lakes Riesling is some of the best Riesling in the world. So, but I didn't want to, I really didn't stop there to talk about wine. I stopped there to talk about their solar-generated energy. And this was the news from this afternoon. In fact, is right here, written down. I use this notebook for more than just signatures. So what has come out of the generation of electricity from those solar panels is that this particular set of solar panels, in terms of reliability, which is how much of the time does the sun produce electricity for this winery in a year? Anyone want to take a guess? It's 12%, 12.5%. Now, what that means is that this winery, if it were completely self-sufficient, if it had to rely on its own means, it would have to have some sort of a generator to produce somewhere on the order of 87.5% of its electrical needs in the year. This is the big problem with solar right now, is that solar just doesn't cut it. Here's a 161 megawatt coal-fired power plant. You all know this. And to replace that power plant would require up to 1,600 acres, but the sun doesn't shine 24/7. Bentech says that 175 of these coal-fired power plants will be shut down in the next 5 years. That's electricity that we need to generate now. How are we going to do it? Well, all right, we can look at Europe. Here we learned that a one-for-one replacement of greenage with solar panels would require up to 3% of the area of Yates County. So basically, what you're looking at right here, this is the scenery that will greet tourists forever. Field after field after field that looks like that. Now, that's where we're going, though. I mean, this is undeniable. We are going to live with a scenery that looks like that. I have no doubt about that. And the question is, how do we get there, and how do we get there really fast? Now, the reality is, here's the other way of doing it. This is windmills. New York Times in the last week has said the development of wind power has two main problems. This is the New York Times speaking to you. The first, wind does not blow all the time, so there must be backup power plants. Now notice they've actually said fueled by natural gas. We can't get away from that, and we're not going to get away from that for a long time. Now, how do we do this? And incidentally, I skipped a point back here, which is that this particular country was funded to put these solar panels in by the European Union. They were able to increase their electrical generation capacity by 1% and then suddenly had to shut it down because they realized that the electrical shock from the sun suddenly shining with more than 1% generation capacity would blow out all the transformers in the country. The same problem is going to happen in the United States as well. So that if we look back at Lakewood, Lakewood is the future. But if we look back at Lakewood right now, Lakewood could feed excess electricity into the grid largely because there are so few other people doing it that it doesn't blow out transformers. But by the time we get to 1%, it's going to start blowing out transformers like gangbusters. Of course, some would argue, why is not that all of that investment on natural gas going into creating a smart grid, which is what we need? That's going to take a lot of time, and natural gas is going to get us from here to there and keep your lights on. Remember, this is all about keeping your lights on, folks. None of you are going to give up your lights at night. Here we go, right in here like this. This is pretty amazing. Here we have a cheese factory and some stuff in the background right there. All right, this is the author of End of Country right here. This particular author, I asked him about this talk that we were going to have, Tony and I, and what he said is, if we could manage but not eliminate the risks of drilling in the short term, is it worth exposing a winery along Seneca Lake to some level of risk in order perhaps to reduce a greater level of risk to a wheat farmer in eastern Kansas or a fishery in Washington State or a retired cop on a pension in Staten Island? This is what I mean by moral ambiguity. This is the type of question that the town of Starkey is going to have to face when they actually vote on whether to ban fracking or not. There will be a risk. And there will be a lot of truck noise. And there will be some of the ancillary problems with getting rid of the frack water and whatnot. But in doing so, first of all, I've demonstrated that there is a reduction in CO2 going into the atmosphere. That's going to slow global warming down. And in slowing global warming down, you may really be helping alleviate a greater risk to a wheat farm in Kansas. All right, here we go. This might not show up well, but one of the big risks right now, you guys, I drive on these roads around here, and I think about groundwater and the groundwater quality. You know what affects groundwater quality more than anything else? That white stuff on the roads. That's not snow. And in fact what happens is, of course, this is salt. When it rains, that runs off. It has to go somewhere. I've been involved in a number of relatively testy debates with my academic colleagues at Duke. Those guys have measured groundwater, and they're measuring lots and lots of salt from roads that have gotten down into groundwater. All right, now, again, moral ambiguity. Fracking is immoral. This again comes from Seamus McGraw, who says, I wish I had the moral certitude as the driver of this car who says fracking is immoral. That takes an awful lot of certitude to do that. This is just completely irresponsible. Talk about moral certitude. This woman right here has more moral certitude than the entire room put all together, because she will tell the New York Times fracking kills, and it doesn't just kill, it kills the land, nature, and eventually the whole world. That statement is simply irresponsible, folks. We cannot have that as part of this particular argument. Not an argument, but rather a debate. That's about as irresponsible as you can get. Here's another example of that irresponsibility. Incidentally, if my notebook is passed around right here, in notebook number 41, which is this notebook, just recently I can open this up to a page that says, eat shit. I hope you live to see I hope you live to see our planet die. Now, the point that I'm trying to make here is that Tony and I are trying to converge on the same thing, which is a sustainable world. The path we want to take is different, and Tony is going to argue that the path can be done without natural gas. I think that my point right here is that it can't be done without natural gas. And I've stopped down at the Lakewood Winery and demonstrated that. The New York Times told you that a week ago when it shows those windmills in Cohocton. It can't be done. And so if you vote down fracking in this area, what you're really saying is, we'll enjoy the lifestyle that includes lights at night, and we'll let some other part of the country, Texas, the Barnett Shale, the Bakken Shale in North Dakota, we'll let them bear the risk. We don't want that risk. All we want is the benefit. And I would argue, using a rhetoric that I've been accused of using, is that that's not the American way. This is America, and we share risks. Basically, your tax dollars are paying for the recovery of Hurricane Sandy, and you're going to pay for it one way or the other. Okay, with that, I think it's time to let Tony get up. Now, what Tony is going to say things that annoy me. I'm going to say things that annoy Tony, but don't misread that as anything but a very important dialogue that's done in a really spirited manner. Okay, so Tony, best of luck with your 30 minutes here. Thank you.
Who's running the projector? You have to close that one down. Upper right-hand corner, I believe. Yep. That's the one. Thank you.